The thing about being 80 years old is that people stop seeing you. They see a chair that's always occupied, a calendar page they're waiting to turn. At Thanksgiving dinner, I heard my grandson's wife tell him I was just a burden we're waiting to be rid of, and she complained about how slowly the old man's money would arrive. I sat there and smiled. Then I excused myself to the restroom, called my lawyer, and quietly, methodically, undid everything she'd been counting on. But George wasn't just some fragile old man. He was a retired structural engineer who had spent 60 years making sure buildings didn't fall down. He still played chess online with strangers, still balanced his own checkbook, still remembered every birthday. And that night, on the phone with his attorney, he learned something that made the betrayal even worse. Tara had already been calling the law office for months, pushing for information about the estate. The attorney warned George that if he simply cut her out, she'd contest it, claiming he was mentally incompetent. She'd tie his final wishes up in court for years, so George decided to play a different game, one she didn't even know had started. George sat in his study that night, the house quiet around him, and for the first time in 60 years of engineering, he allowed himself to look back at a structure that wasn't made of steel and concrete. The structure was his family. And much like the bridges he'd inspected over a long career, the cracks had been visible long before the collapse, if you knew where to look. He'd been a widower for 9 years. His wife Margaret had been the glue holding the extended family together, and after she passed, things began to shift. His grandson Kevin was the one bright spot. Kevin would call every Sunday, stop by unannounced with groceries, fix the loose railing on the porch without being asked. George had essentially raised him after Kevin's own father died young. The bond between them was deep and unspoken. When Kevin married Tara 3 years ago, George was genuinely happy. Tara was smart, polished, ambitious. She worked in pharmaceutical sales. The kind of person who could walk into a room and own it. George told himself the slight coldness he felt from her was just new family awkwardness. He told himself a lot of things. Now, with the phone still warm in his hand from the attorney's call, he replayed the Thanksgiving evening frame by frame. Like a bridge inspection video, he was studying for fatigue fractures. They'd all gathered at Kevin and Tara's house. George had arrived early, bringing his famous pecan pie. Tara had greeted him with a kiss on the cheek and a pointed comment about how nice it was that he'd made the drive all the way out here. He remembered thinking the remark landed strangely, as if she were surprised he was still capable of operating a vehicle. During dinner, she was charming. She asked about his garden, laughed at his stories, refilled his wine. She was so good at it, George thought, that a less suspicious man would have missed the calculation underneath. But George had spent his career identifying structural weaknesses that weren't visible on the surface, and somewhere between the turkey and the cranberry sauce, his internal stress gauge began to twitch. He excused himself after dessert to use the restroom. On his way back, he passed the kitchen where Tara and Kevin were clearing dishes, their backs to him. Their voices were low but sharp. Tara was speaking, and Kevin was not. "He's a burden, Kevin. We're just waiting for him to be gone, and the way he's dragging this out. How long does the old man's money take to actually show up?" She said it with casual precision, like someone discussing an overdue package delivery. Kevin's response was muffled, but George heard his grandson's tone, exhausted, ashamed, and entirely too quiet. George didn't enter the kitchen. He stood in the hallway, one hand on the wall, feeling the unmistakable weight of a foundation shifting beneath him. He returned to the table with a smile, finished his coffee, hugged everyone, and drove home in silence. And then, with the calm of a man who had walked across catwalks 200 feet in the air without looking down, He picked up his phone and dialed Howard Abrams, his estate attorney of 24 years. Howard was at his own family dinner, but he took the call in his den. George didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Howard, I need to change the will. Completely. Tara gets nothing." There was a pause on the line, and then Howard did something George hadn't expected. He sighed, a deep, resigned exhale that came from a place of bad news already waiting. "George, I'm glad you called. I've been meaning to reach you about something." Before George could speak, Howard continued. "Tara has been calling my office for the past 7 months. She wanted copies of the estate plan. She asked detailed questions about the value of your assets, the liquidity of your investments, the exact distribution structure. I told her nothing, but she was persistent. She claimed she was concerned about your cognitive decline and wanted to be prepared." The words landed like a cold drop of water on bare skin. George's jaw tightened. "I have no cognitive decline. I know that," Howard said carefully. "But she's building a narrative. If you cut her out, she'll challenge the will on grounds of incapacity and undue influence. She'll call your competence into question, and given your age, a court might grant a hearing. She can drag this through probate for years, burning through the estate's assets in legal fees, and there's a real chance she could win. The system is designed to protect against exploitation, but it can also be weaponized." George sat down heavily in his worn leather chair. The crack in the structure wasn't just visible now, the entire blueprint was flawed. Tara hadn't just insulted him, she'd been engineering a takeover. And she was doing it with the very laws meant to protect people like him. For a long moment, George stared at the framed photograph of Margaret on his desk, the one where she was laughing at something he'd said. He could almost hear her voice. "You're an engineer. George, solve it." And then, like a beam slotting into place, the solution began to take shape. "What if," George said slowly, his voice quiet and precise, "I don't cut her out at all? What if I restructure everything so she gets exactly what she's legally entitled to after my death, but nothing more? While the actual assets move past her like water through a sieve." Howard was silent, processing. "You're talking about a different kind of instrument. A trust, perhaps a directed distribution that bypasses her entirely, leaving everything to Kevin in a structure she cannot access, cannot contest, cannot even touch." "Exactly," George said. "Can she contest a trust if I'm of sound mind?" "Not if you can demonstrate that mind clearly," Howard said. "Not if there is undeniable proof of your intent, your reasoning, and your capacity at the time of the decision." George nodded to himself in the darkness of his study. The chessboard on his desk had a game in progress, a match against a stranger from halfway around the world. He thought about the pieces, the bishop that moves diagonally past obstacles, the quiet power of a pawn reaching the other side of the board. "I'll give you proof, Howard," he said. "I'll give you proof she cannot argue with." After he hung up, George walked to the hall closet and retrieved an old video camera his son had given him years ago, something he'd never bothered to learn how to use until now. He set it on a tripod facing his chair, adjusted the lighting, and pressed record. The red light blinked on. George smoothed his flannel shirt, looked directly into the lens, and began to speak with the unwavering clarity of a man who had spent his life ensuring that nothing he built would ever fall down. "My name is George Waitley. I am 80 years old, I am of absolutely sound mind, and this is the story of how my grandson's wife tried to steal everything I spent a lifetime building." I recorded that video in one take. No script, no hesitation. The words poured out because I'd been rehearsing them in my head for hours, ever since I'd hung up with Howard. I told the camera everything. My name, my clarity of mind, the comment at Thanksgiving, the fact that Tara had been probing my attorney for months. I held up a copy of that morning's newspaper with the date clearly visible. I read a prepared statement that Howard had emailed me, a declaration of testamentary capacity that listed my assets, my intentions, and my unambiguous decision to exclude Tara from meaningful inheritance. When I stopped the recording, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not vindication, just the calm, steady pressure of a structure locking into place. The next morning I drove to Howard Abrams's office with the video file on a thumb drive in my pocket. Howard was waiting with his senior paralegal, a meticulous woman named Diane, who had been drafting estate documents for 30 years. We spent the first hour reviewing the weapon Tara had already assembled. Howard had a file on her calls, 7 of them, spaced across 7 months. She'd been careful enough to never quite cross into harassment. But the questions were patterned. What protections exist for family members if there's doubt about an elder's mental state? What the probate timeline looked like? Whether an interested party could request a guardian ad litem before death? She was, in Howard's words, building the scaffolding for an incapacity claim, and the system would give her the latter if I didn't act carefully. We designed a trust, an irrevocable structure that would take effect the moment my ink dried. I would fund it with nearly everything: the house in my name, the brokerage accounts, the rental property upstate, the mineral rights my grandfather had passed down. The trust would provide for Kevin's benefit as sole beneficiary, with a corporate trustee who had no emotional connection to anyone involved. The language was airtight: income and principal available for Kevin's health, education, maintenance, and support, but in the sole discretion of the trustee. No mandatory distributions. No spousal access. Even if Tara divorced him, even if she somehow convinced a court to examine the trust, the assets stayed beyond her reach because they'd never belonged to Kevin outright. They would belong to the trust, an independent legal entity with its own rules. And we added a no-contest clause that said anyone who challenged the trust's validity forfeited any benefit they might otherwise receive. Tara would get nothing, and she couldn't sue to get something without losing the nothing she already had. But here's the part most people don't understand about high-stakes estate planning. You can draft the perfect document, but a judge will still look at whether the person who signed it was competent. And Tara was already laying down a paper trail of concern, so Howard scheduled a full neuropsychological evaluation for that same week. I showed up at the clinic the following Thursday, suspicious and maybe a little proud. The doctor put me through 5 hours of tests: memory recall, executive function, spatial reasoning, emotional regulation. I drew complex shapes, remembered lists of words spoken 20 minutes earlier, solved logic puzzles designed for grad students. When the report came back, it said I was cognitively intact, functioning in the superior range for my age, with no evidence of impairment or decline. I had Howard file it alongside the trust documents, together with the video and a dated, witnessed letter explaining my reasoning. The fortress was built. Now all I had to do was wait for the siege to begin. That next weekend there was a family barbecue at Kevin and Tara's place. I walked into their backyard carrying a store-bought potato salad and the quiet knowledge that I was now playing defense on a field my opponent didn't know existed. Tara greeted me with the same practiced warmth. But I noticed something different. She asked more questions than usual. How was my health? Had I been sleeping well? Had I thought about maybe downsizing the house, moving somewhere with less maintenance? The questions sounded like concern to anyone listening, but I could hear the faint click of a woman checking off boxes. She wanted to know if I was weakening, if the cracks were spreading. I smiled and told her I'd never felt sharper. The look that flickered across her face was so fast most people would have missed it. a tightening around the eyes, a split-second adjustment. She was recalibrating. That's when Kevin, bless his oblivious heart, mentioned Howard's name. He said he'd seen an envelope from the law firm on my hall table when he'd stopped by to fix the garage door opener. The whole table went briefly quiet. Tara's fork paused mid-air. I covered smoothly, said Howard and I were just updating some old paperwork, boring stuff. But the damage was done. Tara had a new variable to factor into her calculations, and she was smart enough to know that old paperwork rarely stays the same without a reason. 2 days later, my doorbell rang at 9 in the morning. I opened the door to a woman in her 40s, dressed in a neutral blazer, carrying a clipboard and a government ID. She introduced herself as an investigator with Adult Protective Services. A report had been filed, she said, expressing concern about my welfare. The report alleged self-neglect, possible cognitive decline, and potential financial exploitation by an unnamed third party. She didn't have to say who filed it. I already knew. I let her inside, offered her coffee, and answered every question with the patient courtesy of a man who had been expecting this exact knock for a week. She asked about my daily routines, my finances, my relationship with Kevin and Tara. I showed her my spotless kitchen, my organized checkbook, my chessboard with 4 active games against players from Germany, Brazil, and Japan. She asked about Howard, and I told her he was my attorney of 24 years and that we'd recently updated my estate plan. She asked if anyone was pressuring me to change anything. I looked her directly in the eye and said no, but someone was certainly trying. I then played the video I'd recorded. She watched the whole thing without expression, but when it ended, she closed her clipboard and said the department would be closing the case. As she left, she paused at the door. "Mr. Whatley," she said, "whoever filed this report did so in bad faith. That's not a crime. But I want you to know that what you've documented will make any future legal action extremely difficult for the other party." I stood on the porch long after her car disappeared. The feeling that settled over me wasn't relief. It was the cold understanding that Tara had just tried to have me declared incompetent, and I had survived the first round only because I'd seen her coming. But the war wasn't over. She would try something else. She always would, because people who see you as a burden don't stop pushing until the weight is gone. And I realized, standing there with the morning sun on my face, that the only way to truly end this was to expose her in a way she could never spin, never explain away, never recover from. That night, I picked up the phone and called Kevin. My grandson answered on the second ring, his voice warm and unworried. The voice of a man who had no idea his wife had declared war on his grandfather. "Kevin," I said, my voice steady and sure, "I need you to come over tonight. Just you. It's time you knew everything." There was a pause on the line, the kind that stretches into a question mark. Then he said, "Is everything okay?" I answered him the way I've always answered him, with the truth. "No," I said. "But it's going to be." Kevin arrived within the hour. I met him at the door, and the look on his face told me he'd been running scenarios in his head the whole drive over, none of them good. I took him to the study, the same room where I'd recorded the video. He sat in the old leather chair across from mine, the same chair he'd sat in as a boy when I'd helped him with math homework. My heart broke a little, knowing that what I was about to say would change the shape of his entire life. I told him everything. The Thanksgiving comment, Tara's calls to Howard, the will restructuring, the app's visit. I played him the video. I showed him the trust documents, the neuropsych report, the letter. I laid out the entire architecture of her scheme and my countermeasures, piece by piece, like a bridge designer explaining a failure investigation. Kevin listened without moving. When I finished, he stared at the coffee table for 30 seconds, his hands clasped between his knees. Then he said, in a voice stripped of everything except exhaustion, I knew she was unhappy. I knew she resented how much time I spent with you. But I never thought she would try to have you declared incompetent. I never thought she'd try to steal from you. I told him that people reach for the nearest tool when they feel powerless, and Tara's tool had been the legal system, but the deeper we dug, the worse it got. I asked Kevin if Tara had ever pressured him about money. He hesitated, then admitted that she'd been pressing him to sell my house, that she'd said we could move me into a nice facility and use the proceeds to pay off their debts. Debts he hadn't known about. It turned out Tara had been hiding credit card balances, tens of thousands of dollars, and she'd taken out a personal loan in both their names that Kevin had never authorized. She'd forged his signature on the application. I watched my grandson's face as he put the pieces together. It was the face of a man realizing he'd been sleeping next to a stranger. But the most devastating discovery came the next day. Kevin, with my encouragement, went through their home office while Tara was at work. He was looking for any documentation that might explain the debts. What he found stopped his heart. Hidden in a locked filing cabinet drawer, he discovered a folder labeled George. Inside, handwritten notes dated back 18 months. Tara had been keeping a log of my behavior. Times I'd forgotten a word. Appointments I'd supposedly missed. Conversations where I'd seemed confused. The entries were a mixture of exaggeration and outright fabrication. She'd written that I'd gotten lost driving home from church, when in reality I'd simply taken a different route because of road construction. She'd claimed I'd forgotten Kevin's name at a dinner party, which was a complete lie. This was her insurance policy, the evidence she would present to a court to prove I was declining. The file was thick, methodical, chilling. Kevin took photos of everything and brought them to me. He was shaking. She was going to use this to destroy you, he said. And I was in the house while she wrote it. That night, I called Howard to see if this changed our legal position. Howard was quiet for a long moment, then said something that made the whole situation even more serious. George, if she's been fabricating a medical narrative, that's not just a civil matter. That's fraud, possibly criminal. And if she used that forged signature to obtain credit, that's bank fraud. We have the leverage to end this entirely, but we need to be careful. She could still drag this out. The only way to truly neutralize her is to make her face the evidence in a setting where she cannot lie her way out. That's when the idea for the dinner crystallized. I picked up the phone and called Tara directly. I kept my voice light, casual. I told her I wanted to host a celebration dinner at my house. Just close family, a chance to bring everyone together. I could hear the quick calculation in her pause. She agreed immediately, probably seeing it as another opportunity to assess my condition. She had no idea that the gathering I was planning wasn't a celebration. It was an unveiling. I told Kevin what I intended to do, and he didn't hesitate. He said he'd be there, standing next to me. He also said he was filing for divorce the morning after. I hugged my grandson, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the weight shift from my shoulders to where it belonged, onto the table where everyone would have to look at it. I spent the next 2 days preparing. I organized the documents into a folder for each guest: the trust summary, the neuropsych evaluation, the fabricated log Tara had kept, the app's closure letter, and a copy of the forged loan document. I ran fresh copies of the video file and loaded it onto a tablet. I made my famous pecan pie, and at 5 o'clock on Saturday evening, I straightened my flannel shirt, opened my front door, and welcomed my family inside, knowing that by the time dessert was served, every single person in that room would understand exactly who the true burden had been all along. Tara arrived first, with Kevin, carrying a bottle of wine and a smile that would have fooled anyone in the room except the two of us who already knew what was printed on the papers in my study drawer. She hugged me, told me I looked wonderful, asked if she could help in the kitchen. I let her arrange the cheese plate because it gave her something to do with her hands while I finished setting the table. My sister-in-law, Elaine, Margaret's younger sister, arrived next with her husband, Don. Elaine had always been the family archivist, the keeper of photographs and old grievances. I'd chosen her for this dinner specifically because she had a memory like a steel trap and a zero-tolerance policy for dishonesty. We sat down to roast chicken and potatoes, simple food on my grandmother's china. The conversation danced around safe topics. The weather, the state of the garden, an upcoming cousin's wedding. Tara was luminous, attentive, refilling wine glasses before they were empty, laughing at Don's stale jokes. I watched her the way I used to watch load-bearing walls during renovations, looking for the hairline fractures beneath the fresh paint. They were there, right behind her eyes, every time she glanced at Kevin and found him quieter than usual. When the plates were cleared and I brought out the pecan pie, I didn't sit down. I stood at the head of the table, one hand resting on the back of my chair, and I said, "Before dessert, I have something I'd like to share with all of you. Something that's been a long time coming." Elaine tilted her head. Don set down his fork. Tara's smile didn't move, but her hand on the tablecloth curled inward, just slightly, like a leaf before a storm. I picked up the tablet from the sideboard and played the video. My own voice filled the dining room, steady and clear, explaining who I was, what I was about to do, and why. I named Tara. I quoted her words from Thanksgiving. I described the phone calls to Howard, the app's visit, the log of fabrications I'd discovered in Kevin's home. When the video ended, the silence in that room had a physical presence, like a fifth guest, pulling up a chair. Tara's face had drained of color. She opened her mouth, but I held up a hand and, in a voice she'd never heard from me before, said, "You'll have your turn. But first, Kevin has something to say." My grandson stood. He didn't look at her. He looked at Elaine, at Don, at the table of people who had watched him grow up, and he told them about the folder he'd found in the locked cabinet, the dated entries, the fabricated confusion, the lie about him forgetting my name. He held up the photocopies and passed them around. Then he told them about the personal loan with his forged signature. He put the document on the table. Elaine picked it up, her glasses sliding down her nose, and she read it with the expression of a woman who had once argued a jury to a verdict. She was a retired English teacher, not a lawyer, but she could spot a counterfeit voice in a sentence the way a counterfeiter spots ink. Tara tried to laugh. It came out wrong, a half-octave too high. She said the folder was just private notes, a wife concerned about her husband's grandfather. She said the loan was a misunderstanding, that Kevin must have forgotten signing it. She said I'd clearly been influenced by someone, that Howard was manipulating me. The words poured out in a rush, one lie stacked on the next, none of them quite matching the others. Kevin just looked at her and said, quietly, "I have the video from the bank, Tara. The loan officer sent it today. You're on camera, alone, signing my name." She stopped. The whole room stopped. Don put his arm around Elaine. Kevin's voice broke only a little, the controlled crack of a man holding back a glacier when he said, "I'm filing for divorce tomorrow." I had given her an exit. I had arranged for a cousin to call her phone at exactly that moment, a prearranged signal that would let her leave the room, save face, and let the rest of us finish the pie without her. But she didn't take it. Instead, she turned to me with something black and desperate behind her eyes and said, "You can't prove any of this. You're an old man. No court will believe you over me." That was the moment I'd been waiting for. I walked to the study and came back with the envelope from Howard. I spread the contents on the table in front of her. The trust documents, fully executed, irrevocable, all my assets placed beyond her reach. The neuropsychological report, signed by a board-certified doctor, finding superior cognitive function. The app's closure letter, stating that the report had been filed in bad faith and that I was a person of sound mind, fully capable of managing my own affairs. And finally, a document she hadn't seen coming. It was a certified letter from Howard to the district attorney's office, recommending that they investigate the forged loan application as bank fraud. Howard had filed it that morning with my blessing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The documents spoke for themselves, and the woman across the table, the one who had called me a burden she was waiting to be rid of, finally had nothing to say. She stood up, knocked her wine glass sideways, didn't bother to write it. The red stain spread across my grandmother's tablecloth. She walked out of the house without her coat, without her purse. Kevin didn't follow her. The front door closed with a quiet click that felt louder than any slam. The pecan pie sat untouched in the center of the table. Don cleared his throat and said, "George, I've known you 40 years, and I just want to say that's the most terrifying dessert course I've ever witnessed." Elaine laughed, a wet, shaky release, and then we all laughed in the way you do when the pressure has been so immense that the only possible reaction is the relief of breath. Kevin put his head in his hands and cried. I stood behind his chair with my hand on his shoulder, the same way I'd stood when he was 12 years old and his father's casket lowered into the ground. Some things don't change. The old man is still the old man, and the boy, no matter how grown, still needs him to be. We ate the pie. We talked into the night. Kevin stayed after the others left, and we sat on the porch in the dark, listening to the crickets. He asked me if I'd ever trusted her. I told him the truth, I'd wanted to, but I'd learned long ago that trust isn't a gift. It's a structure you build with someone, foundation first, and she'd never let me see the ground beneath her feet. He nodded, and I knew that was a lesson he'd carry into the rest of his life, a bitter gift from a woman who'd tried to dismantle everything I'd built. The next morning, Kevin went to the courthouse. The divorce was filed by 11. By the end of the week, the forged loan was under formal investigation. And by the end of the month, my trust was funded, sealed, and untouchable. The house remained in my name until my last breath. But, after that, it would pass directly to Kevin, managed by the trustee, protected by a legal fortress that no future spouse, no creditor, no scheming interloper could ever breach. I'd used the very laws Tara had tried to weaponize, and I'd turned them into the walls of a citadel. Here is the detail that surprised even me. Howard called one afternoon to say that the app's investigator had reviewed the entire file, including the fabricated journal entries, and had issued a permanent administrative note on the case. Any future complaint filed against me by Tara or anyone associated with her would be automatically flagged as vexatious and reviewed for potential abuse of process. In other words, I didn't just win the battle. I had the state of my attorney's letter and a paper trail so comprehensive that the system itself had been reprogrammed to recognize her as a threat. The quiet old man in the flannel shirt had built the last great structure of his career, not out of steel or concrete, but out of ink, evidence, and the unshakable clarity of a mind that had been sharpened by 60 years of knowing exactly where the stress points lie. I stood in my garden that evening, hose in hand, watering my tomatoes as the sunset turned the sky the color of a healing bruise. I thought about the word burden. I'd carried many in my life. The burden of losing a wife too young, the burden of raising a grandson through grief, the burden of being seen as fragile by a world that mistakes age for decay. But the heaviest burden I'd ever carried was the expectation that I would just quietly disappear, that I would hand over the keys to my life and let someone else drive it into a ditch. I'd refused. And in refusing, I'd given Kevin something more valuable than money. I'd given him the truth, unvarnished and undeniable. I'd shown him that the weight others try to pile on you is a weight you are always allowed to set down. That night, I went inside, sat at my chessboard, and made my next move. The game was still in progress, a match against a stranger in Brazil who had no idea that the man he was playing against had just executed a strategy far more intricate than anything on 64 squares. I moved a pawn forward, the quietest piece on the board. And I smiled, because I knew something my opponent didn't. That pawn was about to reach the other side and become whatever I needed it to be. And that's the thing about pawns. Everyone underestimates them. They see a piece that can only move forward, one slow square at a time, and they forget the one rule that changes everything. Reach the other side of the board, and the pawn becomes whatever you need it to be. A rook, a bishop, a queen. George spent his entire life understanding that the most overlooked things in a structure are often the most powerful. He was the quiet man in the flannel shirt, the one people mistook for fragile, the burden they thought would simply disappear. But when the pressure came, he didn't crack. He calculated. He engineered a solution that the people who dismissed him never saw coming. This story isn't just about an old man rewriting a will. It's about the moment someone decides they will no longer be a passenger in their own life. Tara had the advantage of youth, the sympathy of a system built to protect the vulnerable, and the cover of dinner table charm. George had something stronger. The truth, clearly documented, and 6 decades of knowing that if you build your foundations deep enough, no storm can wash them out. The legal fortress he constructed didn't just protect his money. It protected his dignity, his voice, and the bond with the one person who had loved him without asking for a return. Kevin's decision to stand with his grandfather, even as his marriage collapsed, reminds us that integrity isn't inherited. It's chosen, often at the highest cost. And the remarkable thing is, once the truth is laid bare in front of witnesses, once the documents are signed, and the video is played, and the investigator closes the file, the schemer has nowhere left to stand. The burden reveals itself to be not the old man at all, but the entitlement that thought it could outlast the truth. George is still in his house, still wearing that flannel, still watering his tomatoes. The trust sits in Howard's office, silent and untouchable. The chess game goes on, and somewhere out there, a woman who tried to dismantle a life with fabricated notes and forged signatures is learning that the system she tried to weaponize now has her name flagged in its memory. The quiet old man didn't just win. He rewrote the rules of the board. If this story reached you tonight, if you felt that flicker of recognition, maybe you know someone who's been counted out too soon. Or maybe you understand what it means to protect something with every tool the law allows, then you already know why stories like this matter. They remind us that being underestimated is the greatest tactical advantage anyone can have, because while the world is busy overlooking you, you have time to think, to plan, to move. We share these stories so they reach the people who need them, the ones sitting at dinner tables wondering if anyone sees their value. The ones who have been told they're a burden and need to remember that they hold more power than they realize. So if you want more real, raw, family-centered stories, hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and be sure to subscribe. It costs nothing, but it genuinely keeps this whole thing alive. And as always, thank you for being part of this. Remember, the pawn is never just a pawn.